Before the Russian invasion, Ukraine was home to about 44 million people, roughly the same as Spain. It's one of the largest countries by landmass, not population, on the European continent. So it's a big and important place, but it's not the kind of place that would normally be at the center of U.S. politics. Except it very much has been. For years, Ukraine has occupied an outsized role in American political discourse. Just look at a guy like Paul Manafort. You might remember him. Back in 2016, he was named chairman of the Trump campaign and chief strategist. He was one of many members of a rotating cast of grifters and yes men who surrounded then-candidate Trump. Manafort, though, was a veteran political operative who got his start in the 1970s, working with the likes of self-proclaimed dirty trickster Roger Stone and Lee Atwater, the late Republican hatchet man behind the wildly racist Willie Horton ad of the 1988 presidential campaign. And then Manafort's career took a bit of a turn. He started making a living, a lucrative one, by advising and lobbying on behalf of dictators and strongmen. In the early 2000s, he started working for Russian President Vladimir Putin's puppet candidate to lead Ukraine, a guy named Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Yanukovych had tried to steal the presidential election in Ukraine in October 2004 through stuffed ballot boxes and voter intimidation, and his opponent, the pro-Ukraine guy, was even poisoned, apparently by Russian agents. Remember that? His face became disfigured. And all of that, the macabre spectacle of the face disfigurement, led to a popular uprising in Ukraine known as the Orange Revolution, and it brought Viktor Yanukovych down. It handed the election to the legitimate winner. It was around this time that Yanukovych hired Paul Manafort. Manafort was assisted by a political operative named Konstantin Kilimnik, who U.S. investigators say is a Russian intelligence official and was integral to Manafort's dealings in Ukraine and Russia. Manafort then gave the Ukrainian Putin candidate a complete political makeover, dressing him like a more traditional politician, coiffed hair, nice suits. Manafort taught the candidate how to mime empathy when speaking to voters, how to modulate his voice when giving speeches. As journalist Franklin Fork reported in Slate, quote, one Ukrainian columnist cheekily asked his readers to identify the 10 elements of Yanukovych rallies that Manafort had imported from the Republican conventions he'd run. And guess what? Their work paid off. The Putin puppet, Viktor Yanukovych, won the Ukrainian presidency in 2010 in an election that was still tainted by allegations of corruption, but it did look like he really won. And things were going fine for this new Putin-approved president for a few years until 2013. And that's when Yanukovych refused to sign this trade agreement with the European Union, opting instead to align Ukraine closer with, you guessed it, Russia. And this decision, along with the naked corruption of Yanukovych and his cronies, sparked massive protests across the country spanning multiple months. Yanukovych was eventually forced out of office as a result, eventually fleeing in the middle of the night to Russia in early 2014. Putin was not happy. He had lost his puppet president, and there were huge pro-democracy protests next door. This was a seismic moment for the Russian president, and you can see that in three brazen geopolitical moves that he made afterwards. The first thing he did was to seize Crimea from Ukraine. Almost immediately after those pro-democracy protests in Ukraine, Putin sent armed soldiers, his little green men, into Crimea, no flags on their uniforms. They occupied government buildings, and Russian forces quickly took control. It was, up until that point, the largest European land grab since World War II. And Putin basically got away with it. There was international condemnation and some sanctions, but nothing close to the outcry we're seeing today. That leads us to the second brazen thing he did. In 2015, Putin deployed official Russian troops outside the former Soviet republics for the first time since the end of the Cold War. He sent troops to intervene in Syria, and they are still there today to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. That intervention was incredibly expensive and brutal, but essentially decisive. Putin managed to secure the victory he wanted, and Assad has stayed in power. That same year, in 2015, Donald Trump announced his run for president. And right before the RNC, where he will accept the party nomination, Trump hires Paul Manafort to come run his campaign for free. Manafort, the guy who got Putin's puppet elected in Ukraine, is now in charge of the Trump campaign. And during Manafort's short tenure, the campaign altered the official Republican platform to tone down its support for military assistance to Ukraine, which in no uncertain terms was a direct gift and signal to Russia. And Trump's own ties to Russian money started coming under scrutiny.
So to be clear, Mr. Trump has no financial relationships with any Russian oligarchs.
That's what he said. That's what I said. That's obviously what our position is.
Convincing. As campaign manager, Paul Manafort also stayed in contact with that alleged Russian operative, Konstantin Kilimnik, who many suspected was just a direct link between the campaign and Russian intelligence. The two men would later go on to cook up this bizarre plot where the eastern Ukrainian territory of Donbass, now the target of Putin's invasion, or the place where the war started, because it never really stopped, that the Donbass would break off into its own pro-Russia country, possibly under the rule of disgraced Putin-backed former Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Manafort was ultimately ousted from the Trump campaign after his obvious corruption and ties to Russia were too much even for them, which brings us back to Putin and his third incredibly brazen act, and that is interfering in the 2016 U.S. election in a pretty profound way. It is, of course, impossible to measure the impact of Russia's hack and leak disinformation campaign, but regardless, Putin again got his desired outcome. Donald Trump improbably elected president. So think about it. After the Maidan, after Ukraine pulls away from Russia, kicking out his stooge, Putin does these three incredibly brazen things all in a row, and they all work out surprisingly well. Seizes Crimea, boosts Assad, helps get Donald Trump elected, all in the span of 3 years. Now he has an ally in Donald Trump, which is, of course, incredibly important, because Vladimir Putin doesn't really have so-called soft power to pressure foreign policy, aside from natural gas and oil. While that can be very influential, it's not the same kind of soft power the U.S. and NATO and others can wield in different parts of the world. But Trump becomes Putin's soft power. We see it play out in all kinds of ways, like pushing the leader of Montenegro out of the way at a NATO meeting and repeating the weird Russian line about Montenegro starting World War III by joining NATO.
Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people.
Yeah, I'm not against Montenegro or Albania.
No, by the way, they're very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III.
That was Trump repeating Moscow's position basically verbatim, just like the way Trump would work to delegitimize NATO as a deadbeat alliance taking advantage of the U.S.
You know, I went to NATO where we were being ripped off because the other countries, you have 29 countries, and the other countries weren't paying their bills. They were delinquent, you know, in real estate. I noticed people are using that word. I've been using it for the last year. It's like a real estate term. That's when they don't pay their rent.
Putin's influence could also be seen in the centrality of Ukraine in Trump's attacks on Hunter Biden, which, of course, undermined the country's legitimacy, highlighted its very real and rampant political corruption, culminating, of course, in Trump's first impeachment for threatening to withhold military aid from Ukrainian President Zelensky unless he helped dig up dirt on the Bidens. In simpler terms, Trump helped legitimize Putin, elevate his status on the world stage, undermine NATO. So when Republican politicians say that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine under Trump, they are probably right, but for the wrong reasons. Putin likely would not have invaded because he did not need to, because Trump was his ultimate gift, doing everything Putin himself wanted to do, elevating Russia, denigrating NATO, delegitimizing Ukraine. Without him in the White House, Putin took matters into his own hands, invading Ukraine, putting the country once again at the center of U.S. policy.